Welcome. I'm your host, Robert McKinley Gilmore Sr., Public Affairs and Public Access. You're tuned in to the Houston Media Source for over 30 years, doing some of the most tremendous broadcasting in the city of Houston and, in fact, around the country now. And we want you to join us for a very, very interesting conversation. Hopefully you'll be able to call in at some point. But we want you to call your friends or family members or neighbors. Our topic centers around mental health. We know in our society today that there are tremendous numbers, over 27 million at an estimate by some of our national organizations, of Americans who need some form of mental health intervention. I've got two very distinguished guests tonight for a qualitative discussion that will help you understand and maybe give you some insight to potential resources or thoughts that you have in terms of how you can be effective. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves first to you, our listening audience. And again, call your friends, call a neighbor, let them know. This is probably one of the most interesting presentations you're going to hear right here.
Good evening, I'm Jacqueline Davis Gilmore, and I am a women's issues specialist, and I am the founder and CEO of Joland Communications. The company that I founded and started is in honor of my mother, Joanne Davis, and my mother-in-law, Joland Davis Gilmore, to help young women, a mentorship program, and women who are going through transition, to provide them and help them find resources that can assist them from a social standpoint, educationally and professionally, and I'm also an educator. And I'm honored to be here.
Great, great. Thank you. My name is Dr. Napoleon Higgins. I am a psychiatrist here in the Houston area. I've been in practice now for 16 years. I'm the CEO and founder of Bay Point Behavioral Health Service, which is a private practice out in the Clear Lake, Southeast Houston area. I'm also author of the book Mind Matters, a resource guide to psychiatry for the Black community. Thank you for having me.
Let me first say thank you to both my guests, and certainly if you haven't figured it out by now, this is my lovely wife. And she is very, very talented in her own right, and as a women's issues specialist, I think she can add a lot of understanding or maybe insight into some of the changes that are affecting our women and of course affecting our society as a whole. I always like to start off by giving the definition that's been shared by the World Health Organization, which in this sense really speaks to what is mental health. And they state, a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. I love that definition because it speaks to what is normal, if there is a concept that we can now say is normal. Because now we're beginning to live with abnormalities in our society, which is really the purview of the psychiatric community. That's why I'm so honored to have Dr. Higgins to speak to this. But I think people need to understand, where does this come from? What is really psychiatry? And historically, where does it come from? So I certainly hope he can explain that to our audience, and those of you can really listen closely to understand how psychiatry in the end plays such a critical means of helping you if you are mentally ill. So Dr. Higgins, could you just begin, where did it come from?
Well, when you look at mental health, you have to understand that maladies of the mind have always been with us, where you would have persons who act a little bit odd or different than the general population. So when you say mental health in its definition, the ability to adapt to a regular, normal environment is key. So the ability to be around others, to be able to associate in communities, things of that sort, of something that is very human, and the inability to do that under normal circumstances, realizing that if you stress an individual enough, you will start to have abnormal type of behaviors. But the question then becomes, can you adapt to a normal environment, a normal situation with life's regular stressors? And when then you're not able to do that, that's when you're looking at the case of mental health. So if you take the definition down to the Greek, which is psyche, which is the spirit, the wind of the individual, the wholeness of that particular person. Iatry is the treatment of the spirit or the wind. So when a person starts to deviate from their ability to be around the regular population, essentially what is wrong with their spirit or wind, and then how do we correct that in order so they can be a part of and adapt to society and move forward and function in life for both themselves, their families, and their communities. So that's the basis of psychiatry itself. When you look at historical documents or even look back to the Egyptians, there is reference to the brain and chemicals of the brain and the ability to manipulate those things through different substances and chemicals. Not to mention as well, you know, of course, when somebody is hurt or somebody is grieving or somebody is having a problem, there's a human spirit within us that wants to help the next person closest to us. So the formation of psychiatry, I would say, has been around forever. But then also, when you look at our current situation, what you'll see even within our own families or within ourselves and in our communities is when you have that inability to go to work, when you have that inability to raise your children, when you have that inability to move forward in life or to prosper within yourself based upon something that's going on in your mind, that is where the treatment of that comes in. And we still do that even to this day, and mental health will always be with us.
So historically, let me just go back to the point. If the early Egyptians or early records showed that some societies, as they were developing, had mental illnesses, and they knew that they had to deal with it in some way. I've heard people say, and I've read some documentation say that there were maybe more quackery methods used early on because people didn't understand the true essence of the mind. Or I've heard and read where there was a lot of study done prior to World War II. And of course, during World War II, when there was psychiatric experimentations done and whatnot. And then, of course, as we got to the more modern part, that was an evolution, if you would. So can you say that from the historical beginnings, that people had some need to address people who were affected spiritually, mentally, but they didn't know what it was?
I would say, that when I look at even medicine, the last frontier of medicine is actually the mind, of what things we don't understand quite well. Why do people behave and do the things that they actually do? So even though that was a primitive time, and then even to this day, we still wonder, why would somebody go out and do that? All right. Or why would they behave that way? Right. So I would say, as much as we've learned over the last 100, 200,000 or even 10,000 years, we still wonder, why did they do that? And sometimes we even wonder, why did I do that? Right. All right. So we still are affected by that mystery portion of it. But understand that also people have understood the mind acts and behaves differently depending upon what you put in it. All right. So, when you look at drug use or alcohol use, people have always seen that depending upon the substance, it can actually change how your mind functions and works. And so my thought about understanding mental health and how the mind can change has been around forever. It's not been a new thing. It's been an old thing. Now when you look at modern medicine, I would say medicine now seems to be even more dependent upon psychiatry. We're talking more about mental health people are more engaged at this particular point because of the behaviors in mass media and the ability to see the behaviors. It would be one thing if it happened in your own home, but now when it happens on the news, it shows up on the news, all the channels, all the cable channels, it's on YouTube, and people see your abnormal behavior 100 times themselves because they watched it over and over and over. So with this increased exposure, I think it's causing us to take another fresh look at psychiatry and mental health and trying to understand behavior and why we do the things we do.
Professor, I want you to give some insight to your knowledge in terms of how you view it as it relates to, of course, women. This has been a significant population that has gone through a tremendous change. I'm not referring to the Me Too movement, but if we included that, there are some dynamics there which are, of course, mentally motivated along with these physical dynamics. But, I mean, from a historical view, I mean, how do you see that?
I think that from a historical view, as the doctor was speaking, I mean, everything kind of just makes its way back to the mind and the healthiness of the mind. I remember my grandmother and all that she endured, and my mother and my aunt back during those times. Perhaps things were different, and there were maybe more greater challenges, but they still prevailed. Resources perhaps were not provided for them based on social justice issues, the injustices that were going on then. And we know that there are injustices still going on now, but they still managed to persevere. They kept their mind, their body, their strength, their soul. It was all strong. It was a strong, solid foundation. They knew they needed to have that in order to provide for their family or their families. And so fast forward to where we are now, it saddens me as an educator, as a women's issues specialist, when I hear of women who are doing things that are erratic, as the doctor kind of mentioned, out of the norm, the behavior. Perhaps what we do at home, in the private area of our home, is okay, but when it spills out into the public environment and the erratic behavior comes out, even if it's one woman that's doing it, it affects all of us. It doesn't matter if we're educated, non-educated, degreed, non-degreed, certified, non-certified, licensed, non-licensed. It doesn't matter our skin color. We're going to be held accountable for our actions. There were a couple of incidents this week that saddened me. One recently that happened in Houston, the woman at the restaurant, and we don't know all that was involved with that, but it was enough for people to open their eyes and to look and see that there was something going on with the psyche and perhaps something going on with the erratic behavior. What would make a person act that way, react that way, and then come out into the public and get into your vehicle, and law enforcement gets involved, and it ends up the way it ends up?
I thought one thing you were saying, and I thought about it historically, was the fact, in my mind for some reason, went to Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, for many who might not have ever heard of her, was one of the first women advocates in America who promoted the movement of women having equal rights. Once upon a time, women couldn't vote, they couldn't own property, they were viewed as property in a sense, and there was obviously a great deal of acceptance in our society as a whole. In other words, this was the norm. That's why sometimes I use the statement, what's normal? This was the norm at that time. And of course, Susan B. Anthony and other women advocates led a movement for women, you know, and that's kind of the people who were over the temperance movement. If those of you might remember, once upon a time, it was against the law to sell alcohol. I mean, you could imagine in America if you could sell alcohol today. But there was a time period in the early 20s or whatnot, during the 20s, that alcohol was banned because of this movement. And then, of course, it led to women gaining their right to vote, and then, of course, driving automobiles and being more of a part of society. So it's almost like an evolution, if you would. I guess I'm looking at the bridge between the pressure that's been applied, the idea that is there a norm for women, or is there a norm in our society that people haven't been able to adjust to, or in adjusting to it have made it abnormal? And then their behavior, which is addressed by law enforcement first, because, obviously if we would have had our legal advisor here, the law enforcement does deal with people who have abnormal actions in society, regardless if they're mentally ill or not. And so most of the facilities, law enforcement jails and around the country now are saying that the largest percentage of people in them are mentally ill or under some type of psychotropic meds who are incarcerated. That's from New York, Chicago, California. They're all 1/4, if not higher. So, I mean, this level of normalcy, which we now have in our modern society, is impacting whether it's women or men or anybody else, but it's affecting them to the point of them becoming more abnormal. And like you said, Dr. Higgins, it speaks to now being able to say, you see it on social media. I mean, I've seen some stories recently, just horrendous. I mean, in terms of, people who were professional doing some things. I don't know if they thought they weren't going to be discovered, but you wouldn't think that they were mentally ill, to demonstrate that behavior. Or if you, in the incident like what you're saying about the lady acting out, you wouldn't think it was mentally ill, but I would assume that you go to any court in America, not just Houston, Harris County, you will see different cases which you say, well, okay, where did this really come from? In terms of a behavior. So much so that we have our schools which now practice, unlike when I was in school and we used to practice for a nuclear attack. I don't know if y'all remember that. I'm kind of dating myself. Everybody, they would ring the bell. Everybody says it's a nuclear attack, and you would go and sit under the table. You would get on your knees. Now, I don't know how being under a table would help you from a nuclear attack, but that's what we did. Now it's for an active shooter.
Absolutely.
And that leads to a lot of stress with the kids, the parents, and everybody else is concerned. So I guess what we're seeing, I use that term sometimes a little too much. What is the new normal? How should we address it? People out there are watching us saying, is this normal for the person, my loved one, my friend, my family member? Or in the last couple of days here in the Houston area, we've had around the country, we've had a couple of, again, workplace shootings. Is that normal now for people to be aware that when a person gets let off the job or told that they need to correct their behavior, to now monitor them because they might come back and do something? I mean, what do you think, Dr. Higgins?
Well, I would say that right now we're on a different set of new pressures. Things that we had not seen before, we're starting to see now. I would say, part of my life growing up in the country, that was a gun next to every door. I mean, you would see a gun on the table, but people were not pulling out the gun and shooting other folk at their job, or kids weren't taking the gun to school. You didn't have those things going on. So we're in a new day and a new society, realizing that now we have to adapt to it. And the question becomes, what causes maladaptation? Now, I'm hoping that we're not sliding into a situation where we believe that if I have a dispute with somebody over something that may be major, but not that big. I mean, obviously you got to let go from the job, but there are a lot of people hiring people right now at the same time, that because I felt like I was misled or mistreated, then now I retaliate by killing a group of people who had nothing to do with that particular situation. And even if they did, why are you in a situation where you believe mentally that you're hopeless to the point that now you need to kill other people and then kill yourself, or spend the rest of your life behind bars? Behind, they let me go, or I thought I should have got the promotion. It doesn't make sense to me. Now it's starting that you're starting to see this over and over, and you start to wonder in fear, is this now the new norm or the new adaptation? And I would push against that. But furthermore, with our law enforcement, essentially they're the entry and access point for many people to mental health. The problem is that because we're using mental health in a legal situation versus a civil and community issue, since we're using it in a legal situation, now people are being incarcerated for mental illness, which to me is something that you did a behavior based upon something that is wrong with you internally, and instead of getting you help, we're now sending you to the prosecutor, and the DA is left with a wide range of things that they could do about your mental health situation. So it's going to be important that we work with our law enforcement, realizing that they are typically that first access point, and it's going to be extremely important that they understand mental health, realizing that so often they are the community's advocate, and the provider and the treatment provider, because they have to make decisions based upon how people are doing. And so therefore they also need to be able to be educated about what they're seeing, realizing that over half, and some would even say up to 3/4 of SWAT calls are based upon a mental health issue. And what is the training of the individuals who are now interacting with those individuals? So I've seen some police departments and, sheriff and county where they're actually learning more training. They're putting units together specifically for mental health. But the fact is that every last police officer, anyone interacting with the public, needs to be able to identify and then de-escalate the situation.
As much as possible.
As much as possible.
Absolutely.
But you can't do that if you don't understand what you're looking at. So when you see a person behaving oddly to the point that they're not doing, what they're doing is disruptive, what they're doing is not helping their situation or anybody's situation, and they're putting themselves in a bad situation. So often we have to understand or ask the question, is this mental illness that we're interacting with? And then if it is so, then what do we do about it? And how do we get this person access to the care and the help that they need, versus we're looking at 3 months in jail, then you get out and then you reoffend because you're not on medication, you're not receiving treatment, you're not getting therapy, no one's addressed the childhood trauma that's going on, nobody's addressed the issue of a lack of resources. And now you're back inside the jail, back inside the criminal system, or you're interacting with police and acting now abnormally, and then the outcome from that can be detrimental because the person is misreading the situation, and then sadly, when law enforcement may misread the person and what their intention is. And then the other part of that is if their intentions are not good. And even though they're acting out of character for themselves and for what the norm would be, then what do the police then do? So I would say it's multiple layers to how do we improve the overall mental health of our communities, of our families, and our society as a whole, that works with not only the individual, the patient, the client, the family, the community, the legal system, prosecutors and judges, and all of that goes into improving mental health within our civil community.
Absolutely.
Professor,
Absolutely.
your insight for the...
It's interesting, as he was saying, that it when it goes from 0 to 100, the situation, I have to say that I think that families, we play a big role. It's kind of like when I was growing up, it was don't talk to strangers. Now it's stranger danger. Don't talk to stranger. Now it's if you see something, say something. And a lot of times in communities and throughout society, we see something, we don't say anything, particularly if it happens in our household. And we see a breakdown in the mindset, a breakdown in communication. And, we know it's going on. We don't say anything, particularly if it happens in the household. We try to solve it ourselves in the household. Then it escalates outside in the community, in society, at a restaurant, in the workplace environment. And there's a total liability issue when it comes to how we act and behave at home. Might be different on the job. Maybe it needs to be the same. Maybe it needs to be different. But that responsibility, that accountability, and that ownership for us as adults is what we have to remember. And so with families, we have to say something, particularly women. And I go back to, my goodness, back in the day, Susan B. Anthony, Mary McLuhan Bethune-McLeod, Sojourner Truth. There's so many women, even fast forward now, who endured so many challenges, but yet they prevailed when the system was broken. It didn't work. They were discriminated against. They couldn't drive. Women couldn't drive. Couldn't work. We're told not to work. You had to stay at home. Now there are women in other parts of the world. Yeah, watch the children. That's your job. I mean, and now the women want to work. They want to drive. In some countries, women are just now being able to drive. In some countries. And they're happy to drive. I mean, it establishes their wholeness, their independence. They're able to do things and still provide for their families. Somewhere along the line, we've got to make sure that we don't lose touch with what our role is as women, and what our role is for families and as society to help women who may be in trouble. It's different if you're having a bad day as a woman, or a bad hair day.
Well, let's go back to that. Let's go back to that. When you say roles, it seems like the roles have all changed in a sense. I mean, I'm just saying. There's no longer a specific role as you stated, right?
Well, women, we can knock down doors and we can wear hats too. In a lot of cases, we have to knock down those doors from an educational perspective, corporate jobs, perhaps maybe religious positions, engineering. We have a lot of rights that are given to us. A lot of young people, young women, men and women, who are seeking better opportunities for themselves. They realize that they have to first be able to put the oxygen mask on themselves first in order to help themselves. Then they're able to help others. Then they're able to help families. Then we're able to help our neighborhoods and our and communities. When children, okay, we have to teach them. As adults, we have to be able to be held accountable for our actions. And if these actions are negative, if we sense within our families there's some type of chemical imbalance or something's not right, you see something, say something. Otherwise, we find ourselves in situations that law enforcement may have to get involved with, or doctors, and then the medication comes into play, and that may work, it may not work.
Well, what I always notice is that so often the woman inside the home is still more often than not the caregiver. They're typically the one that recognizes the mental health issue, and they're typically the one to bring the child in very often, especially in the Black community.
Yeah.
You know, typically when I see a Black male, it's either his spouse made him come, or the mama brought him in. You know what I mean?
A grandmama brought him in.
Yeah, grandmama brought him in. Somebody else, some woman forced him into the door.
Yes.
Sadly, but the problem with that is that because of that delay, it's one thing if we saw this happen around 9 or 10 years old. It's another thing when you're 19, 20. And it's a whole other issue when you're 59, 60, and it's been going on since you were 8 or 9 years old.
Yes.
And the ability to help correct what the situation was when you've had a life that's been shaped around this particular issue. But having the woman in the home being able to understand and recognize is key.
Yes.
And now I'm starting to see more men get it. I'm starting to see, actually, I would definitely say I've been seeing more even Black men inside my practice, more so than I did 5 or 10 years ago. But also just males in general will notice that, hey, listen, there's something going on with me that's impacting the people around me. I don't want my wife to fear me. I don't want my kids to be afraid of me. I don't want to be that angry, grumpy, mad person that walks inside the house. Then everybody kind of scatters until I go into my room and then everybody comes back out. A lot of men don't want to be that that particular dad, that
Right.
particular father, that
Right.
particular brother. So now I'm starting to see more men who seem to get it. Another thing that you keyed in on there is you're looking at trauma inside the home and how we don't talk about trauma. Realizing that 1 in 4 women will be molested or raped before the age of 18. And we can't forget about our boys, 1 in 6.
Yes.
1 in 6 males
What?
will be molested or raped before the age of 18.
It's boys.
Boys. And it's not always by a man.
Really?
Yeah, and we assume that it's the male who will do that type of behavior.
Right.
Realizing that on average it's mostly men, but it's not all men. All
1 in
right?
4 females
Yeah.
before the age of
18.
18.
Before they reach that young adulthood.
Right. And 1 in
6.
6.
1 in 6 males. And we don't talk about it, we don't discuss it, but how that shapes the rest of your mind and your body throughout your life. There's that ACE study, Adverse Childhood Event Study, which actually can predict how much trauma you had, well, which shows that how much trauma in your childhood actually predicts how long you will live in life.
No.
There's a direct correlation between what happened in your childhood and the stressors that were put on your mind that then stress the entire body. So often we don't pay attention to it. These things happen to our home. The child may not say anything, all right? Or people will know inside the house and we don't talk about that. Well, somebody needs to talk about it.
Yep.
Somebody needs to talk about it, and somebody needs to address it with a professional. Now, realizing as a psychiatrist, we're deemed as people who write prescriptions, but realize that a whole lot more than that happens inside the session. But but sometimes you may need a social worker. All right. Sometimes you need a psychologist or a counselor or law enforcement. Sometimes you may need the psychiatrist. All right. Realizing that all of that goes into trying to help a person, especially in those serious situations that we often see happen inside of homes and families. The problem with being a child inside of a home is that odd things go on around you, but you have no control over any of it. Now, as adults, they can run, they can hide, they can leave, they can sue, they can divorce, they can get married, or whatever else may happen. But as a child, it's like you're just like a rubber ducky bobbling in the water, banging into the side of the tub. You have a lack of control, which makes it even more traumatic. I remember once hearing at a church, like, why don't kids sing that song? Because kids obviously haven't seen anything yet. They haven't experienced anything. And I'm saying to myself, if the adult around them experienced it, the kid inside the home experienced it as well, except that the kid had zero control of what was going on around them with those adults. So we have to make sure we pay attention to that home, and we discuss these things, we talk about these things, realizing that trauma happens, and we've got to get the help. We've got to get to the right individuals and persons. Because what that then sets up is abnormal behavior later. Because of so much goes into the child's mind, the hard wiring is going on. You're shaping behavior and adaptability at a very young age, basically from the womb on. So essentially, if they're getting this poor adaptation because of the poor abnormal environment, we talked about mental health being the ability to adapt to a normal environment. Right. Imagine if you're growing up in a home with an abnormal environment and how that shapes you, and then you turn 16, 17, 18, and the cop pulls you over and you don't know how to deal with authority figures simply because you couldn't trust them in the first place from early on. Now you have abnormal behavior that can then get you set up for a lot of poor things to happen in your life or even cut it short.
Plus September is National Recovery Month around the country, and certainly over the years it was primarily focused towards drugs and drug abuse. But of course, in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years in particular, since the DSM-5, it's been added that, comorbidity, has to be recognized with drugs. So you allude to the idea of so early people being impacted, women being impacted, 1 in 4. What do you think about that, Professor?
Oh, there used to be a saying from the cartoon characters of Miss Piggy and Kermit the Frog. And Kermit the Frog would always sing this song or say, being green is not easy. I think that Certainly, you know, being a male is not easy. Being a child, we know, is not easy. Being a woman as a woman is not easy. As the doctor said, we're the caregivers, and there's so much weight that's it's like we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. And I think that there are times when we need to be able to channel our aggression, our emojis, the emotions that we experience.
We're going to the phone. We have a particular question. Go right ahead, caller.
Yes, this is Reverend Dr. Matthews. I'm certainly appreciative of the comments that's been given. Thank you, Dr. Gilmore, for the great work that you've been doing in bringing the awareness and educating the community of this serious problem of mental health issues that exist in our community and our society. I guess my question is, a redundantly old problem. When we...
You're breaking up on us. We're having some technical difficulties. Say
Yeah,
that
I'm so
again.
sorry.
Say that again. Ask that question again.
My question is, I'm sorry I'm in a hospital here and here to support a family who's going through a tragic situation as we speak. But one of the things that I see the lack thereof is psychological counseling, mental health counseling provided for people who get exposed or experience tragic situations or come from dysfunctional households and those type of dynamics. So when will there be a summit that the leadership will bring the healthcare professionals, the leaders in our political era and law enforcement, community-based organizations to really come up with a practical way of healthcare delivery to address mental health crisis? We know that there's lack. We know that the problem exists, but again, I see so many fall through the gap and don't get the adequate assistance and help that they need to overcome those traumatizing experiences.
Thank you very much for your question, Dr. Matthews. I certainly would appreciate you telling the family and others that we are praying for them. We've asked our audience to please pray for those who've been impacted. Let me ask Dr. Higgins that, as our caller has asked a very unique question, and you've been involved in a national effort in the co-authoring of the book Mind Matters. A number of psychiatrists were involved. Has that been a concern? You've been to all of the national medical forums, the national meetings. Has that been some discussion? You know, I mean, we can try to plan something like that in Houston, but has it kind of been a sentiment around the country? Because I think this is a national crisis we're in.
I would definitely say that, you know, what the caller said about the crisis of being able to access health care and then on the correct level. What he mentioned is something that we talk about all the time, but you don't see it being put together. Where essentially, you know, the large psychiatry groups, the large medical groups, law enforcement, judicial agencies, you see that you see it more likely in a smaller community. But what are we doing nationally to come up with a really good decision and putting resources towards getting that information out? You know, and some of that is the mindset of the individuals. It's the politicians who you vote in, and what is their desire to do something about mental health. You know, every once in a while, every few weeks it seems like, or every few days, there's some sort of shooting. There's something major that happens. Next thing you know, the politicians are on television talking about all that we need to do to help X, Y, and Z, but then you'll see funding get cut in your local community, and even nationally, Medicare will be cut, Medicaid will be cut. And what's sad about it is that when you actually fund mental health care and people are thinking well and behaving well, they actually do things like get jobs and pay taxes. You know, I was talking to someone in law enforcement how they had a new program where he was working, and it's a local county. I won't mention the name just in case they don't continue to fund it. But he said that we showed that we are able to create jail diversion and save the county millions of dollars per year by allowing us to have the training and being able to access mental health services. It saves money. It keeps people out of jail, which then keeps them out of prison. It keeps away violent behavior. It keeps people in home and in with families and paying on jobs and paying taxes if we do it this way. But we don't, even though we know it works. So that goes into the mindset of many of our public officials on why, to me, you don't see this large coming together to figure out how to better address mental health. Typically, it's going to be very piecemealed, and that's unfortunately which then affects us as a population and as a society.
Professor,
Absolutely.
your thoughts on that question?
I agree that, leadership starts from the top. That's what we've been taught. That's what we've been told. And so it's critical that something needs to be done. Efforts need to be made on a state level, particularly that impact people who need help. As the caller, Dr. Matthews said, there are people that need help. There are people that experience post-traumatic stress on all levels. Women, a lot of times people are shocked that women experience post-traumatic stress, anxiety at different levels. And so something needs to be done. We can sit here at a round table and talk about it all day, but until we actually, actually do something about it concrete, then we'll just continue to talk about it, and people will continue to have mental health issues.
Well, I think, too, I guess one of the observations is the coordinated effort. You mentioned, Dr. Higgins, the coordinated effort. I don't know if there's a thought that the medical community or the counseling community or the academic community can cross the bridge into the law enforcement community, and give them suggestions or ideas that might be amenable to help. But as the person gave you response, it does, in the end, if the person is brought back into the general society, benefit the larger society. Besides the disruption, the dysfunction, the disruption that occurs, whether in families or just in our general society, the civility of our society is at stake. I guess when we look at tragedies like what's going on in the Carolinas, which hit us just last year with Hurricane Harvey, and the school shooting, prior to the end of the semester this year, and how resources were gathered for security officers and resource officers, and based upon what you've submitted is a thought that you already have kids walking around in each one of these schools, regardless if it was a shooting there or not, who've been affected in some way. Maybe the idea is, and I've heard this from time to time, whenever we've done this show on the Public Affairs, Public Access channel, that there should be more discussion about it in that kind of setting, in this kind of setting, that there are others who need to hear it, because some of those who are in those agencies know that's the problem. So it's like, I made the statement, I'll continue to make the statement, where are we going to be in 20 years if we stay on this same path and not address it adequately? I mean, where is it going to be?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. The thing is that, one, you want to have good ideas, good information, the coordination of services, and then the resources to support it. The thing is that if agencies aren't talking across agencies, if the police or the law enforcement is not talking to mental health, which is, is not talking to the judges and to the politicians, and we're all speaking individually, then essentially you could throw a whole lot of money at it and not get a whole lot of results out of it. So that coordinated situation has to occur, but so often, with us in our current society, if the media turns away from it, it's like it must have went away and it's all good. Now, working in mental health, I've seen where Harvey is still impacting people. Like, the fight is not over.
Right.
The story ain't over. It's just the cameras have moved on to the next tragedy, but we still have these continual issues inside of our community, and then trying to force our politicians, our leaders, to continue to coordinate efforts to find out how we could best service. I do know in the medical community that we're taking a more holistic type approach where essentially we want mental health to be a part of your overall health care. Realizing that life happens to everybody, all right? It happens to everybody. So the need to have mental health on those front lines. So often, when tragedy happens, it's like everybody thinks about the tragedy, mental health is in the background. But it's we see the continual ripple effect that goes on for days, weeks, months, years. It's thought it may take some families 10 years to recover from what happened with Harvey. It may take a full 10 years to get back to where they were when that tragedy happened. And so often everything is moved away, but then the mental health is left behind. So I know that I can't speak all bad. I do know that there are those who understand the need to coordinate, but the question becomes, can we continue to keep our focus on that particular path that we need to coordinate, we need to talk, we need to put resources towards it, both awareness, physical, but also financial resources to combat this particular problem.
Professor, your thoughts?
I know I attended a few months ago a Mom Summit that was held on the campus of Houston Community College Central. That particular program was geared towards mothers, and it had dynamic resources that were provided for women of all ages to serve as a guideline to help them, and the resources were there. So in terms of what the caller was saying, where are those programs for mental illness and to help families who are going through tragedies, some type of summit, and they provided an excellent breakdown of speakers and workshops that were provided, and that the women were required to attend those workshops, those educational trainings. There are people that want help, but if it's not out there for them, and if they don't know anything about it, then there is no way to channel that aggression or whatever that mental anguish or a mental health issue is. And if they're just dealing with family, that's it. That's all they know. And it's kind of like you've been in the dark for so long, you don't know what light is. You don't know what goodness and blessings can come your way until you actually reach out and know that those opportunities are available for you. And as an educator, that comes through education. We have to be able to educate others. As a women issues specialist, one of my primary jobs is to educate young girls so that when they become women, mentor them, whether in middle school, high school, or in college, as I do now with mentoring young women, they will be productive citizens, productive women. And if they should go through struggles and hardships, and we know, you wake up every day, keep living, you're going to encounter some type of challenge or something, they won't fall by the wayside. They'll have a strong mindset that they will know how to deal with whatever mental issues or inabilities that perhaps come their way.
What was the essence of the rationale, logic, or even the perceived outcome of the book Mind Matters? The idea of all of the psychiatrists, African Americans in particular, coming together to put together. I've read the book. It's certainly a resource guide. What was the essence of it in a sense, and what are you all expecting to happen? Because it seems to be very practical.
Well, the point in the book was trying to connect the Black community to understanding mental health.
Right.
So often people don't access resources, sometimes because one, they don't realize they have an issue, but then two, you actually can do something about the particular issue. So we're all psychiatrists, so we treat all populations, but another reason we targeted the Black community is simply because we're the least likely of all groups to access mental health care. Now, you think about the historical issue of Blacks in America, the story of how we've been lied to, the story of slavery, the story of civil rights, the current issues that we see daily pop up in the news regarding African Americans and the struggles that we're under. Under all of that pressure and stress, oddly enough, it's expected. You're more likely to have a mental health issue by being an African American living in, living in this country. Then at the same time, we don't access care for that. So a lot of times we suffer in silence, we suffer in shame, we suffer in ignorance. So the point is, we're trying to help demystify the information so that our community can connect. Now, the other fact about this particular book is that it's mental health. So it's a resource guide for anyone who's interested in mental health. And so we go through those major psychiatric diagnoses so that people can understand what the diagnosis means. So often I'll see a new patient come in and they'll say, I say, what brings you in today? And they'll say, I'm not sure, but I'm taking these pills. And I say, what pills are you taking? Well, I take 2 of the green ones and 1 of the orange ones, all right? And it's funny shaped. And I say, what is it supposed to treat? And the person really has no clue on what their diagnosis is or what the medication is supposed to help with. And I'm like, whoa, that's not good. All right.
Where did they get the pills from?
And then they're not able to tell you who the doctor was. So the point of the book is so that people can be educated and understand what it is that is going on, because the more information and education that the person has, the better they will do overall.
So
Absolutely.
you said the psychiatric community is not taking full responsibility of what this opioid addiction, this dramatic epidemic in America, over 75,000 every year.
I would say, well, the odd thing about psychiatry is that we don't write, for the most part, we don't write pain medications.
Okay.
All right. But we are typically the specialty that helps you get off the pain medication. So a lot of times when you're looking at psychotropic medications or medications that deal with the mind that cause addiction, oddly enough, we don't write the majority of these. But we're stuck with the bag of trying to fix it after they were put on it by somebody else. Now, trust me that, the medical community is paying attention to how much of this do psychiatrists write, but all medical doctors write. And so right now, there's a lot of close looking at what are the physicians doing and why are these people, why are patients and clients ending up on these medications that now they're addicted to. And now behind that is because of the addiction, now you've created criminal behavior and trying to obtain the drug that you feel like you need. Because the issue with addiction is that one person can use and enjoy themselves and not need to pick that up again. Another person may use and their brain reacts as if it's air. Like the inability, if you're going to not use, it's like trying to hold your breath forever and ever and ever and ever. And your brain is telling you, go get it, go get it, go get it. So we got to be very careful as physicians to not try to help prevent creating people who then become addicted to a medication. And then, of course, you do have some of that on the patient. You do have people who come around looking for drugs who like to get high, So it's a combination of illness versus society. So often individuals will feel like if your medication is not mind altering, then obviously you didn't give me a good medication.
Found thought on what would you recommend to a family member or loved one who needs to increase intervention as soon as possible?
What I would say for a person to increase intervention is, one, understanding what is going on. So part of the reason that we wrote this book is so that people can recognize. So it's a read where you can read it from cover to cover, and it's written for patients and families. So what we did is took out all the psychobabble, all the big long words that causes people to not be able to understand what you're talking about. And part of the hardest thing was we rewrote this book probably about 4 times each line, and some even more than that, simply because we've learned it in a scientific term, and then we speak it back out in the same language we learned it in, but it's really not speaking to the community. So education within the community itself, so they understand and recognize mental health is key. But then being able to access services early. Many times will help you prevent from actually seeing me. So, when it comes to mental health, the psychiatrist typically, I'm like the backstop. Realizing that so much could happen well before you end up getting to me, all right, that needs to have the interventions early on. So understanding, educating, recognizing, and then going to get the help at that period of time. Realizing that if you get help early, you can stay adaptive to your environment. So we want to keep you adaptive to your environment, and the earlier the intervention, typically the better the outcome.
Closing thoughts, Professor?
I will say that today is my birthday, and that surely as a woman I have gone through some things. I've been homeless. I was burned over 40% of my body when I was a little girl. Couldn't walk for a while when I was young from the severe burns. The doctors wanted to amputate my right leg and my right arm. But I am here today as a woman. Not as a black woman, not as a white woman, I'm here as a woman, okay? All women have every right to be educated. It starts from when you're a little girl. No matter what you're going through, we have the right, we have the power within, the spirit, the soul, the mind, the body, the heart, the sinew, to be educated. If you want that education, it's there for you. It's there for the asking. It's there for the taking. Knock down the doors and get your education. Be strong. My grandmother used to say that the difference between a stumbling block and a stepping stone is how you move your feet. Anger is not how we should move our feet. Retaliation is not how we should move our feet. Intervention, as Dr. Higgins was saying, education is how we move forward in this day and age.
Let me say thank you to Dr. Higgins. It's certainly the dynamic book. I've read it. Mind Matters, 12 psychiatrists all over the country. I mean, they condensed it. I'm going to say thank you, Professor Davis Gilmore. Thank you very much for sharing with our audience here. The month of September is considered a dynamic month, and I think many of us have been affected by any number of traumas or problems, but there is help. The United Way here in the Houston area, 211 line, based upon what they do to refer you to any number of groups or organizations like NAMI, National Association of Mental Illness, or the Mental Health Association, or any number of resources like the council or others who might give you access into getting you some help, as Dr. Higgins alluded to, and that's as early as possible. Let me say again, I've been your host, Robert McKinley Gilmore Sr. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Public Affairs, Public Access Show, broadcast right here from the beautiful studios of the Houston Media Source, and they've continued to broadcast over 30 years. This is a great example. Stay tuned, tell your friends, share this information. You can see it again, and make sure you do what you can to help somebody who needs mental health. Until we say again, have a good evening.